elsewhere. My name is Ekke Nõmm. I'm the head of the Estonian School of Diplomacy, and it has been my great pleasure to cooperate with GFSIS and Georgia for many years. And I would like to thank both Ekke Petriashvili and GFSIS and also Swedish SIDA for facilitating these discussions. We have had these discussions on topical issues for a few years now, and it has always been a pleasure to conduct them in GFSIS in Chitaza Street, and it's always, more lively and more comfortable, and we're all a bit perhaps frustrated with Zoom, but this Zoom cloud also has a, let's say, silver lining, because it allows us to approach more people and attract a wider audience. Now, today's topic, as you all know, is security challenges in the Nordic-Baltic and Black Sea region. And we have an excellent combination of speakers today. They are a good combination of being expert, diplomat, politician. Some of them are actually have all of these qualifications. I think the topic as such was relevant when we started to plan it a month ago, and now taken where we are security-wise between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea today, then the topic is even kind of more actual. And I think that we all have a similar kind of threat assessment, and we agree that the challenges in this area stem from the same source. So yeah, I'm looking forward to good discussions today. The audience will be able to put questions via chat after the three speakers have made remarks and presentations. And yeah, I'll first hand the floor to Mike Winnerstig. He is from Sweden. He's the head of the Department for Security Policy at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, Paet. Now, Mr. Winnerstig is also a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of the War Sciences. I'm glad that usually pacifist Sweden actually has such an academy. But Mr. Winnerstig has also published extensively on the foreign security and defense policy of the United States, as well as on NATO and related transatlantic issues. And Mr. Winnerstig has also been a lecturer and a researcher in some prominent institutions like the Belfair Center for Science and International Affairs, Harvard University, ICDS, and indeed Estonian School of Diplomacy. Mr. Winnerstig will first put forward his ideas to us concerning the Baltic Sea region. Then Ambassador Alex Petriashvili will focus more on the Black Sea, and then Mr. Urmas Paet will kind of be a bridge between the two areas and facilitate final ideas and discussions. But now, Mike, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ekke. Very nice to be here. Very nice to be back at the Estonian School of Diplomacy as well, where I spent some 6 years off and on teaching. It was a very nice period, actually. I have to start with a disclaimer somewhat, because although I'm speaking as the head of the Department for Security Policy at the FY right now, I'm only speaking my own mind. What I'm saying is not going to be in any way connected to the Swedish government's policies. I need to make that statement just to cover myself and the government as well. So, the traditional views in Sweden and Finland about security policy were for a very long time a view of isolationism as the preferred way of dealing with threats in the region. Isolationism in the sense that we both had very strong, if a bit old-fashioned, defense forces and a security policy which meant that we were not being actively at least engaged in any of the potential conflicts in our own region. For Sweden's part, this was a policy that emerged in the early 19th century, in 1812 essentially, after we had lost what was for 600 plus years a part of Sweden, namely Finland, to Russia then in the war of 1808-1809. So this policy continued for slightly less than 200 years. In the early 2000s, though, things had changed so dramatically, both in terms of the regional kind of setting, as well as in our own defense posture. Sweden in particular, Finland to a much lesser extent, did disarm after the end of the Cold War. Over a period of some 15 years, we went down in Sweden, that is, with a figure between 85 and 94%. We decreased our defense numbers in terms of people in particular, but also in terms of brigades and surface combatants and aircrafts and so on, with around 90%. This is a very substantial cut. Finland did not do that. On the other hand, they also cut down their force, but on the other hand, they and their force were old-fashioned stuff from the beginning. A lot of old-style infantry forces, for example, they have numerically maybe some 15 or 20 brigades after mobilization, but only 3 of them are considered really modern and effective. Sweden, on the other hand, used to have 30 brigades. In the 1980s, when I did my military service myself, we had about 30 army brigades. Half of them were pretty bad, half of them were pretty good in terms of modern equipment and so on. But still, we had 30 brigades which covered the entire country, roughly. Now we have 1 brigade at most, 1.5 if you're generous, and we're planning to have 3 brigades in maybe 10 years' time, which means that the Swedish armed forces, the Swedish army these days is about as big as the Estonian army, roughly. And Estonia then is a country some 8 times smaller than Sweden, regardless of how you count, more or less. So there have been tremendous changes there in Sweden, not so much in Finland, although they also scaled down their defenses dramatically after the end of the Cold War, but they still kept a lot of people. I think they're now saying that they have 230,000 people after mobilization in the armed forces, but only 3 modern brigades on the other hand. For both of us, though, Russia has always been, at least since Peter the Great or so, which is more than 300 years, the defining geopolitical threat and problem for us. We saw that in different ways from time to time, but that has still been the case. It's still the case for Finland, although they don't say it as explicitly as the Swedish government does. But anyway, Russia is the major challenge, and this is not going to change. What has changed, though, is the both Swedish and Finnish view on what is allowed if you are a non-aligned country. Both Sweden and Finland have ditched the concept of neutrality. Sweden more so than Finland, I would argue, because one of the major goals for Finnish security policy is to, quote unquote, stay out of conflicts in Finland's neighborhood. This is not that we say in Sweden anymore. We know fairly well that if there is a conflict in the Baltic Sea region, Sweden and Swedish territory and the Swedish armed forces will be affected from day one. This has both geopolitical reasons as well as political ones, not least given the fact that Sweden is now in a process of ever closer integration, to use an EU concept, with NATO and the United States in particular. We do have a very special relationship with Finland. We're actively planning together right now what to do in the case of war. But we are also very much trying to integrate ourselves with the United States bilaterally and with NATO as an alliance. Although we do have domestic problems still, that means that we cannot say or cannot start a process even to join the alliance. I can return to this later on, but it's domestic policy based. We are still working as if we were an essential part of the alliance here, in many ways at least. Just to give you an example of the latter, we had an interesting exercise last autumn where American special forces based in the United Kingdom flew over to Sweden with their B-22 Ospreys, a very specific kind of aircraft. They landed here, they refueled, they did exercises with our special forces, and then they were escorted by Swedish fighters and American fighters as well over the coast and the Baltic Sea to Estonia, where the Ospreys and the American special forces landed, and then were used as so-called forward attack controllers, forward air controllers, sorry, aiming laser weapons at targets on the ground in a shooting range in Estonia. And at the same time, there was a destroyer from the four-destroyer base, the American base in Rota, Spain, in between Sweden and Estonia, covering the airspace, as that destroyer is specifically good at providing air defense, essentially putting up an A2AD bubble over the Baltic Sea here. And this means that the Swedish armed forces, the American armed forces, and the Estonian armed forces were highly integrated in an operation with a very explicit direction, namely to stop an armed Russian attack against Estonia. And this was an open thing. It was reported in the press. Some of the old school guys in the left fringe of Swedish politics were extremely upset of this because they knew what this was up to. They knew the reactions in Moscow, I mean, the implicit reactions in Moscow anyway, and they were extremely worried about this. But everybody else essentially thought that this was a very good idea, and that is, in a way, the way of the future for the Swedish armed forces too. So I think I've used my 7 minutes, Ekke, but I'll be most happy to develop on this if you would like.
Thank you very much, Mike. And in a way, if I may add, then when an Estonian speaks or thinks about security, he thinks about NATO, and it's interesting and very kind of encouraging to listen to you that also increasingly in Sweden and Finland, you tend to think in terms of NATO if you think about security. But now I'll hand the floor to Ambassador Alex Petriashvili. He is a career diplomat with over 20 years of experience representing his country in both bilateral and multilateral formats at the highest levels. And Ambassador Petriashvili's political experience is mostly related to the Free Democrats political party in Georgia. And currently, Ambassador Petriashvili is also an international affairs anchor, the host of a weekly TV program. So in a way, many interesting and specialist qualities that are there in Ambassador Petriashvili. And Ambassador, I welcome you to make your remarks.
Thank you, Ekke. Good evening to everybody. It's a really great pleasure to participate in this very, very interesting seminar, webinar, with such distinguished panelists and with your moderation, Ekke. And it's great to see a long-time friend of Georgia, Urmas Paet. We had the pleasure to work together on Georgia's further integration in European and Euro-Atlantic community. So it's a very important time, very challenging time. And if it was 1 month, if this webinar would have taken place 1 month before, I would start talking about challenges of Georgia in the Black Sea region. But nowadays, the whole world is talking about Ukraine as the #1 issue, the hottest issue, and with regard to threat, with regard to military buildup, which we are witnessing on the border with Ukraine by Russia, as well as in Crimea, which is part of Ukraine annexed by Russian Federation, and also inside in the eastern Ukraine, there are around 2,000 instructors and advisors, Russian advisors and instructors, according to my information. So this is not the challenge we can call. This is the threat number one. And this threat is not only to Ukraine. This threat is not only to Georgia and not only to the Black Sea region, but it's to the entire democratic community and the regional security. Because, and I'm really very glad and happy to hear and to see the very firm commitment of the international community to the security and sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and the firmness of the statements and the messages, of course, is of the utmost importance. And they all urge Russia to stop building up the military forces and provoking Ukraine for the next military confrontation. But I cannot agree more than with the President Zelensky and Ukrainian leadership that the concrete support is needed. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba, in the meeting with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and the NATO-Ukraine Commission has underlined the urgency and the importance of supporting, increasing the support to Ukraine aimed at the strengthening of the military capabilities of Ukraine. And I must say that we in Georgia strongly believe that Russia, personally Vladimir Putin, is testing now the Western community and in particular the new US administration. The President Biden's administration, and it will be a litmus test for the Western community in Ukraine again. I hope very much that the de-escalation will take place and the messages will be heard, but you never know what will come up in the Russian heads, especially when there is around 100,000 in total, 100,000 militaries concentrated in around and around the Ukrainian border. So confrontation between the democratic world and Russia is rapidly increasing, and we are hearing about new possible sanctions to be issued by the United States, and the statements that if Russia provokes the war with Ukraine, that according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, it will have to pay the high price. Russians justify their actions as the countermeasure to the joint drills which will take place very soon, Defender Europe 2021, with the participation of the European and Euro-Atlantic community. But I think with all military capabilities which has been built since the annexation of Crimea in the Black Sea, and they are adding more and more military capabilities. I just saw the news that the 15 vessels, military vessels, are moving from Caspian Sea to the Black Sea to participate in the exercises, the drills, military drills. But if we look at the Black Sea region today, with 3 NATO member states, literal Black Sea states, Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania, and with Russia, with its military capabilities, it really looks very much like the battle scene. I hope very much that it will not get to the military confrontation and the diplomacy prevails, but very frankly speaking, without, for Georgians and for Ukrainians, without joining NATO as soon as possible. I know very well there is no consensus, and the consensus is needed, But without joining NATO, there will be no feeling of long-term stability and security in our countries. And with granting the membership to Georgia and Ukraine, I have no doubts that the situation would rather de-escalate than further escalate. So in last days and weeks, there is a lot of talk about Ukraine, in not months as well, and much less about the problem of Georgia, the occupation, continuous occupation of Georgian territories, Abkhazia and Samachablotsky Valley region by the Russian forces, and this is remains as the biggest challenge and the threat to Georgia. 60 kilometers from the capital city Tbilisi, there are Russian troops located on our soil, dislocated on our soil, as well as there is a full-scale military base in Abkhazia. And we see almost every week installing the barbed wires on the Georgian controlled territories, kidnapping like pirates, Georgian citizens, I mean civilians. The latest vivid example of the Russians' violent behavior was the kidnapping and detention of Georgian citizen Zaza Gacheladze. He was wounded on the Georgian controlled territory, then taken to Tskinvali prison, and he was sentenced illegally to the 12 years of detention. And I don't see, frankly speaking, very much of reactions coming from the international community. We could discuss the reasons why is that happening, but this is the reality. So when we talk about Ukraine, when we talk about Black Sea security, when we talk about the regional security, we should not forget Georgia's problem and challenge. And I cannot miss this opportunity not to touch upon the developments which took place last year in Nagorno-Karabakh. We had a tectonical change in the landscape in wider Black Sea region, in South Caucasus, and now as a result, which is most worrisome for us and worrying us, Georgians, as well as other states in the region, is the new military base in the region, new Russian military base in the region with around 2,000 soldiers. The Russian military base, unfortunately, has never been the source of stability. On contrary, it was always the source of instability and the provocation of the conflict.
Ambassador Petriashvili, may I interrupt you here?
Sure.
We actually, you touched upon a very important thing. I mean, the change of overall landscape in the Caucasus, but we might discuss upon on that also during the questions and answers. And I actually would also like to apologize for failing to mention that you served also as the State Minister of Georgia for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. And this is actually very important in today's seminars or discussions contest. And I would also like, reiterate your thought that we would probably all agree with Minister Kuleba's idea that this confrontation today is actually a wider thing between democracies and autocracy, and we might kind of develop this idea also further during.
Definitely. Just two small points. It's not less important. The hybrid threats. It's a threat for all of us, for each of us. We have been through this. First was Estonia in 2007. All of a sudden, one beautiful day, we may be the target of a cyber attack coming from the Russian Federation, GRU or FSB. I saw the Swedish Prosecutor's Office has concluded that it was definitely the GRU who attacked the Swedish Sports Federation. I mean, they are getting everywhere where they can get their hand. And as well as the propaganda and misinformation. It works. You all remember all Soviet propaganda and Suslov, the ideologies of the Soviet propaganda. And I must say that today's Russia propaganda machinery is much more sophisticated, and it needs to be countered. So Georgia, Ukraine join the European and Euro-Atlantic community, and we should join our efforts. And last but not least, the challenge for Georgia is the internal political crisis. I cannot miss this point as well. And for Ukraine and for Georgia, delayed reforms is a problem. Further we delay the reforms, further longer we try to reach the political consensus, longer will be talks among the skeptics in the European and Euro-Atlantic community that Georgia and Ukraine are not ready for joining the Euro-Atlantic community. So I will stop here. I think.
Didi Madlova, Ambassador. Yes, we took quite some time here, but now I will hand the floor to Mr. Urmas Paet. He's actually if I'm not mistaken, but I think I'm not. He's the longest serving Estonian foreign minister, and he started his career as a news, as a journalist, and he has intimate knowledge of Georgia from being a foreign minister, but also as a member of the European Parliament today. He's actually the vice chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the European Parliament, and Mr. Paet has also, during his service or his work in the European Parliament, kept a close eye on developments in Georgia, and he has been a shadow rapporteur also on the implementation of the EU association agreement with Georgia. So, Mr. Paet, you have naturally a lot of experience in the Baltic Sea area, but also in Southern Caucasus and in the Black Sea. So, I would hand it to you to make some kind of conclusion, put forward your ideas, and then looking forward to having a good discussion afterwards.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening. Well, unfortunately, what we are witnessing is that there are more and more tensions around Europe and also partly inside Europe. So that if we look from European Union's perspective, then yes, we have had and we still unfortunately have conflicts and tensions on our eastern border, on our southern border, and unfortunately more and more also in the north. I mean here, developments in Arctic. So that from Europe's point of view, yes, what we witness is that situation is getting more and more problematic. And here I see one main reason, and this is, yes, the struggle or even conflict between authoritarian viewpoints and authoritarian regimes, and on the other hand, democracies and democratic viewpoints. Because what is happening is that both big authoritarian regimes, China and Russia, are on the one hand more and more aggressive, on the other hand sticking more and more together. So that the recent developments in this sense are quite obvious, where Chinese leaders say that yes, they support multilateralism, but at the same time they tell to everybody that, well, human rights, for example, is internal business of every and each country, including China. And at the same time, Russian foreign minister says that the European Union is unreliable when he is hosting the High Representative of Foreign Affairs of the European Union in Moscow. And at the same time, different new business projects, but also political engagement between Russia and China. And on the other hand, if we look at democracies, then unfortunately during last years we witnessed lots of turbulence, for example, in the relations between the United States and the European Union. Hopefully, now after Biden took presidency in the US, the situation will change, but I put it like this, that actually damage done. So that in this sense, to have adequate balance point between democracies and authoritarian regimes, we also need much stronger cooperation between democracies, especially EU and US, between EU and NATO, and of course also all other democratic countries all around the world. But here we are still in the process. And one of the sub-themes to this overall or global conflict between authoritarian and democratic regimes is also what is going on in Russian immediate neighborhood. So that if you look back, be it 2008 in Georgia or 2014 in Ukraine, then of course the main reason for these attacks is that Russia wants to keep these countries under their direct control and influence, and does not want to see that these countries are moving closer to Western democracies. So then in this sense, this reasoning is there, and it's still there, because if you speak about Ukraine or Georgia, both countries still want to get closer to the EU and also NATO. So that if we put these ambitions of one concrete country, I mean Russia, in the larger framework of the conflict between the authoritarian and democratic regimes, then I guess it also makes this picture clear. Because if you look all the rest of post-Soviet territory, then we still see unrest and conflict in Belarus, which is also very important country for Russia, because of course Russian leaders and Russian president does not want to see that it is impossible that people simply come to the streets and dictator has to go. And that's why, of course, the full support from Kremlin still is there for Lukashenko and the Belarusian regime. If you look at Moldova, still very complicated situation with Transnistria and Russian troops there. If you look at the Nagorno-Karabakh, war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, who finally settled the situation, it was Russia, ministers of foreign affairs and others from Baku and Yerevan. They didn't go to Brussels, but they went to Moscow to settle the things. And if you look at Georgia, then occupation of territories continues. At the same time, internal political turbulence in Georgia, of course, which is not helpful as well. And as I mentioned, we see the conflicts and struggle actually also in other places all around the world where democracies and authoritarian regimes are in conflict. Recent events in Myanmar, for example, where right after the military coup, also Russian generals were present together with, of course, Chinese colleagues. Or if we look at several African countries, not talking about Syria, Venezuela, and so on and so on. So that we see this kind of hotspots all around the world, where it's not only, how to say, local conflict or local business. And the same, unfortunately, also applies to the region which is close to us. So that the countries I mentioned at the moment, especially, of course, Ukraine, still Georgia, Belarus, and so on. So that to be in this and strong enough in this situation, of course, it demands that the EU member states have to stick much more together inside the EU to strengthen also common foreign and security policy of the EU. It means that not every decision should be made on the basis of consensus, because it is not the most efficient way to do also foreign policy. EU-NATO cooperation, and also more to stick to the principles. If I just mention under these also geopolitical conditions issue like Nord Stream 2, where it's obvious that this project is in conflict with the EU energy security, but there is still no mechanism how to stop it from legal point of view. Or we see that in the same Arctic area, EU is still too slow and too reluctant. So that it means that, yes, there are still lots to do also inside, Western communities, inside European Union, also inside NATO, and NATO and EU together. Because I guess this is for all countries in our geopolitical area with quite complicated history, the strongest guarantee if Western communities actually stick together and also manage to work together, especially vis-a-vis with big authoritarian regimes, be it Russia or China. So that to sum up, for example, still the example of this cooperational form like 17+1 with China, it is very strange because it clearly undermines the common foreign and security policy of the EU. So I could imagine that how angry we would be in Estonia if there would be, the format 17+1 with Russia, where some EU countries are participating, but Estonia not. But these days, the same approach should also apply for China. So I stop here my starting monologue, and I just want to see that the balance point between authoritarian regimes and democracies is not shifting to the wrong direction.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paet. And I would remind also the listeners and the participants of the discussion that you're most welcome to put questions via chat and Facebook to us. And maybe I will start with my, in a way, first question, if I may put it actually to Mr. Urmas Paet, because Eastern Partnership as an initiative, I know it has been an important one also to you personally, and Sweden has been a founding father of it, and it is very important for Georgia and Ukraine, which are in the focus of today's discussion. So, Mr. Paet, how do you see what will be the future of the Eastern Partnership initiative?
Of course, it will depend very much what the countries who participate in this program, what they actually want. Because if you look at the events during last year, for example, for me, it's not any more clear what, for example, Azerbaijan wants from Eastern Partnership program, or what Armenia wants, or what, of course, Lukashenko's Belarus wants. So that it's obvious that these differences inside the Eastern Partnership countries are more and more deeper. So that still I have, good hope that Georgia, Ukraine, and hopefully also Moldova will stick to the core principles why Eastern Partnership was at all established. So that it's also good now, 11 years after Eastern Partnership was established, to check which were the core principles of this program, why it was established. And if you read them, then you realize that countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan, having fight to each other and war to each other, and of course Lukashenko's Belarus, they have violated all the core principles of Eastern Partnership. So that in this regard, I guess from practical point of view, of course, this kind of differentiation between those three, hopefully at the moment, who still want to look at the Western experiences, not only to get good business deals, but also to have substantial democratic and rule of law reforms. And then the rest three countries, I guess that there should be very clear differentiation. So that as framework, because yes, it is our neighborhood anyway, as framework, maybe it can be still there. But from substance point of view, I guess Eastern Partnership needs very deep reforms.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Urmas. Alex, Mike, are you willing to elaborate on your ideas on Eastern Partnership? Or,
Thank you very much, Ekke, for raising this issue. Very important. It's Eastern Partnership, and really we expect that as very rightly Mr. Paet mentioned, there will be a differentiation because Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova are on the path of towards the Euro integration and clearly want to be part of European Union and want to more integration with European Union. So there are 3 countries which have not clear vision for future of relationship with European Union. There are complicated relations with, for understanding reasons, with Belarus. So Eastern Partnership cannot be implemented in the same way for Belarus as for for Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova. So I hope very much that the initiative which was established 11 years ago by Sweden and Poland will be focusing more on the states, on the countries which are committed to further integration in the European Union and with the European community.
Could I add something to that again?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. Yes.
No, I agree completely with what the ambassador just said. Sweden and then Foreign Minister Carl Bildt was very much a building block in the formation of the Eastern Partnership. I'm not an expert on this myself, but I know that the initial ideas were, of course, to integrate all these countries within a wider Western field. I wouldn't say sphere of interest, but definitely a field of values and common aims and so on. Now we've seen that some of these countries are going in different directions, and I agree completely that these countries who do want to be included and to integrate in the general European and transatlantic security and other structures should be dealt with first and helped in that endeavor. I mean, this is obviously the whole thing. We have had a very problematic war in the Caucasus now, or between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and that is, of course, problematic for the whole enterprise. But on the other hand, we have countries like Georgia and Ukraine, which are really working towards these ends. And although we all know the problems in front of us in terms of Russian aggression and so on, we still have to deal with these countries in the first place. So I agree basically with what was said before.
Many thanks, gentlemen. Now, if we open the questions and answers section, then naturally we come again, as it seems to be topical today. We come to Ukraine. There's a question on how do you think that the claimed support of Western governments for Ukraine is enough? And what is the main task of the international community to support countries in the region against the Russian threat? And the next question coming up again is, for Ukraine. Even though we do not have Ukrainians today in the panel or behind the table, but the focus point today seems to be Ukraine. So what could the Western community do for Ukraine, and what should Ukraine do? Who would like to put forward their ideas? Mike?
Yeah, well, I can start. I was considering the big transatlantic military exercise under American leadership, which is going to take place this year, Defender Europe 21. I noted, as far as I could tell anyway, that this exercise has no kind of real integration of Ukraine, at least not of Ukrainian territory in it. It is a lot of things happening in the Black Sea and on the Balkans as well as in Estonia and other places like Poland. But there is no real big-scale military exercise with allied forces or Western forces in Ukraine. What has been, coming back to the Baltic states and Estonia and so on, very effective in the Baltic states has been the NATO's enhanced forward presence forces. That requires NATO membership, of course, before you can have such an arrangement. But having military exercises with the Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil every now and then would, I think, be a very good thing for both NATO and other individual countries like the United States to do. It would provoke the Russians most likely, but on the other hand, if this is a regular thing, then the deterrence value would be enhanced pretty substantially, I would say.
Thanks. Yeah. Alex, Urmas, on this issue.
Well, if I may to add, then well, what the Western countries can do, of course, mainly they can support the legitimate governments and legitimate political will, be it at this case Ukraine or be it Georgia. So that in this sense, of course, this is important that also all what is happening in domestic politics in Ukraine and in Georgia is also clearly targeted to be modern, well, democratic country with strong rule of law, with low level of corruption and so on and so on. So that this is also very important part of solving this conflict, because as long as Russia still sees that there is chance for them to keep Ukraine or to bring Georgia back, for example, under, well, Russian strong influence and control, then they continue. But if they simply see in one point of time that actually, well, the history has changed, that there is no more chance to get these countries, well, back under their, well, direct control, then there is also no point actually to waste resources for this kind of conflicts. But as long as there is still hope, well, unfortunately, we will see that these tensions, these conflicts will continue. So this is one very important principle. Second is that, of course, West and Western democracies also, of course, have to be united. I mentioned before this very, still, I guess, remarkable example of Nord Stream 2, where one hand actually is not knowing what other hand is doing. So that what West can and should do, including Europe, is to be also very clear in their political choices. Not so that, well, rhetoric is one thing, but when it goes to action, then, well, somehow it happens in different way. There have been, of course, ideas all around that Ukraine should get quickly, you know, map from NATO and some, well, military stronger cooperation. Well, in principle, it's nice and right, but again, then we also should see what is, well, what is reality, what is really doable and what's not, so that for any, well, further decision what concerns NATO, of course, we all know we need the consensus among NATO member states. Any more concrete steps from EU, we need consensus from 27 EU member states. And here is the question, do we have this consensus? Even a few months ago, when European Union wanted to start with personal sanctions against Lukashenko and his people in Belarus, it took around 2 months to agree to have these sanctions. And the problem was that only actually one country in the EU was opposing this. So that as long as we have this kind of, well, decision-making mechanism in both organizations, then I guess this kind of reality check is always also very important. So that what well, Western countries, European Union, NATO can actually do and what is realistic is in this sense to be, of course, politically united, also to pressure Russia politically, to continue with well, different available assistance to Ukraine, to Georgia, and at the same time, all the time also to remind to Ukrainian and Georgian leaders that actually in first hand, they are those guys who have to keep the motivation of the country and give also clear comments and signals to the societies where they actually are going, so that we then reach also what is the motivation of Russia, and of course Ukraine and Georgia and others can also decrease the Russian motivation to keep this conflict alive. So that there are no, how to say, very easy and black and white solutions. So that the support, there are many elements, but at the same time, not to reach the point of disappointment. I don't think that it is also the right way to dream that, well, tomorrow there will be very decisive decision, be it from NATO or something else. It is very time consuming because the consensus building these days is not the easiest exercise.
Many thanks, and we already are discussing this question, and well, being a friend of Georgia, it always comes the question inevitably about Georgia NATO, but in more broader terms, does the escalation in Ukraine actually make the likelihood of close integration of Ukraine and Georgia into NATO and EU more probable, or would actually EU and NATO be kind of frightened off with it with this standoff? So this is a question to put to all three of you.
Unfortunately, if I may, Ekke, unfortunately, I agree with Mr. Paet that it's a time-consuming thing to build the consensus on the NATO membership of Georgia and Ukraine, but we should continue working on the solutions, on finding the solutions which will be the consensual for all member states. There is, as you know, the so-called Rasmussen formula of the non-use of the Article 5 on the entire territory of Georgia, on the occupied territories, until the restoration of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Georgia. There are some other possibilities also. As it was mentioned, the Defender Europe 2021 will not take place on the territories of non-NATO member states, and I must say that Georgia has contributed more than enough and is the battle-tested ally to NATO in the operation in Afghanistan. We have sacrificed more than 30 our militaries in the fight against the terrorism. So we are close enough in planning the operations with the NATO allies. So I would be happy to see rather sooner than later, the joint planning and organizing the huge military exercises, including the territories of Georgia. There are very good military exercises yearly in Georgia with participation of the NATO member states. But again, we may be missing the time while looking for the consensus, and it is unrealistic to hope that by the summit, which is upcoming in June, NATO summit, there will be a consensus. But the issue of NATO, Georgia's and Ukraine's NATO membership should be elevated. There are no active discussions. I mean, since the change of the administration in the United States, there is a shift, some rather soft shift in the transatlantic relationship and the transatlantic issues, but still we don't hear enough discussions about Georgia's and Ukraine's possible integration, and the call from the Ukrainian president to grant the membership action plan is joined by Georgians. We've been calling for granting Georgia membership action plan, but we're still there where we were in 2008 when NATO took the commitment to integrate Georgia and Ukraine.
Mike, Urmas, on this issue, we don't have much time. So, I mean, if you intervene, then please make your intervention short. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, I think this is a major problem. What could happen, though, if the Russians do something really bad in Ukraine, is that even the Germans, for example, who tend to be the most negative vis-a-vis the integration of Georgia and Ukraine in NATO, for example, they could change their mind. They're already changing it to a certain degree because of the Russian actions in general. But still, they have too much deals with the Russians right now, in my mind anyway, to do this right now. But that could change. And it could change also for countries like Sweden and Finland, for example. If we see that this is something that really happens, Russian aggression again, that is, then things could change in a fairly fast fashion, I would say.
Right. Thanks. I'll take one question from Marcel Karolashvili, Georgia's ambassador to Estonia. Current EU sanctions against Russia, could we expect strict approach from the EU? I'll actually address it to Mr. Paet because maybe he's closest to the rumors in Brussels. What is the mood in Brussels vis-a-vis Russian sanctions?
Well, there are, in general terms, two types of sanctions. One is that there are sanctions against concrete persons. This list just was updated because mainly of Navalny case, so that the more people were added to the personal sanctions list. And then another circle, there are so-called economic sanctions. So that I think that, well, there should be no big problem to extend once again the list of personal sanctions to add more people there. But of course, this is with quite limited impact. To find new spheres where to put economic sanctions, which are not harming, well, civil society or society of Russia, it is of course much more difficult exercise. And well, again, the reality is that even now, when was under discussion the list of new persons for personal targeted sanctions, then there were also proposals to add there, you know, some oligarchs and some other people who have quite an impact to Kremlin and other circles, but the outcome was that these people are not in this list. So that once again, even with each and every name in this kind of sanctions list, you need the agreement from all 27 member states. And as I, well, just described a few moments ago, this is a very difficult exercise. Also what concerns, well, from common sense of point of view, very logical decisions, but still. So that in this sense, I think that if there will be another round of, well, having new sanctions, then to have more names in this sanctions list, it could happen. But otherwise, I guess everything, of course, will depend what really is going to happen. So that, of course, we all now hope and also some people work to avoid further escalation on, with Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, for example. But of course, we at this stage, we don't know in final end how the things are going to develop. And of course, the sanctions policy and the reaction from the EU very much also will depend what's next. Hopefully, there will be no, well, something very serious next, but once again, you never know. Because when when we started this webinar, in my initial monologue, well, I described that actually the authoritarian regimes, including Russia, are at the moment very much on the very aggressive mood and telling directly that actually they simply don't care what EU is telling them or EU is doing.
Thank you. And actually, 1 hour has passed flying, but I'll still perhaps take one more question and address it to all of you. In a couple of questions in the chat room, Turkey was mentioned. I mean, if we take the security arrangements, then Turkey until recently was not kind of mentioned as a major player, and now after Karabakh and let's say Erdogan's statements on Ukrainian territorial integrity, where do we put Turkey, and can we trust Turkey? How do we treat an increasingly authoritarian Turkey in this context? Are you willing to put forward your ideas as far as Turkey is concerned? Mike?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not an expert on Turkey, really. I know from a geopolitical perspective that Turkey and Russia have major problems with each other historically, which means that they're still pretty much competitors. On the we see that in the Middle East, for example, certainly in the case of Syria, for example. But there are also ways and means or distinct niches of security policy where they cooperate, as we know. They're highly problematic. This is my kind of a note on Turkey. They can be played and dealt with, I guess, but they are part of NATO still. The Americans seem to go along with them reasonably well, despite all the problems with the S-400s and F-35s and so on. But it's a very, very problematic country, and increasingly so. I would not say, though, that they are anyway on the way of becoming a Russian ally. I don't think so.
Alex?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Mike that there will be no alliance between Russia and Turkey. I excluded. They will be the competitors with each other. And the move made by Turkish president hosting the Ukrainian counterpart and providing the full support on the territorial integrity and sovereignty, and not only, they have agreed, they have signed the joint statement, which includes the very close cooperation in the military field and in military technologies development field. They will be jointly doing some military equipment. This is very important that Turkish military vessels, together with US military ships, will be visiting Ukrainian ports, and it will be a very significant political support. So we, from our point of view, Turkey is a NATO member state, and it is important that it is supporting Ukraine in these very important times.
And finally, Urmas, Turkey?
Well, I think that the biggest problem related to Turkey is that Turkey is very fast shifting towards full authoritarian regime. So that this is actually the big issue, be it, for example, European Union-Turkish relations, which are very bumpy at the moment, very problematic. We also have seen problems inside NATO related to some Turkish positions. So that in this sense, I agree that there is no natural alliance between Russia or Turkey, for example, because there is also for Turkey very emotional historical issue related to the Crimea because of Crimean Tatars. So that I guess this is also one of the clear reasons why Turkish president expressed support to Ukraine. At the same time, Turkey and Turkish authoritarian regime feels free to buy military equipment from Russia at the time when other NATO allies tell to Turkey, don't do this. But in this sense, Turkey was and is still doing this. or if you look at some Turkish operations and actions in Middle East, in Syria, or again not together with other allies and not listening what other allies are doing, of course it increases the tensions. Or also a few months ago on the Mediterranean, more or less direct conflict between Turkey and France and military ships over there. So that in this sense, the main problem with Turkey is the same, the shifting towards authoritarian regime, and it makes, of course, Turkey and Turkish decisions much less predictable than it should be in the case of democracies. We remember when Erdogan started, then his message was that the foreign policy goal of Turkey is that no problems with no neighbors. Today, it looks that it is completely vice versa, that you have problems with all your neighbors here and there. So that in this sense, yes, Turkey is NATO member state. That's why, of course, I guess also work inside the NATO with Turkey is absolutely important. I also would like to see that EU and Turkey relations in one day start to get normal again. But again, the recent visit with Sofagate in Ankara was not very encouraging in this regard, because also all these human relations and personal relations also played a role. So that yes, the short answer is that Turkey is important for, of course, NATO as member state, but also for Europe, European Union, because of its geostrategical position and also active, foreign policy. We do or don't like it, but this is the fact. And at the same time, all those negative developments we have seen, again, it needs unity from Western countries to handle, in this sense, Turkey, so that to balance all those negative recent developments. Because Turkey, as I said, geopolitically, also militarily, is for Europe a very important partner in final end.
Now, dear friends, I think it is my my task to wrap today's event up. We ended up on a relatively, not pessimistic but not optimistic either note, because everything seems to be ambiguous, and therefore we will keep an eye on the developments on security challenges in these areas, and GFSS and ESD. We will continue with this series of public discussions, and we invite all the good people in the audience to rejoin us. And of course, quite naturally, I would like to thank very, very warmly today's speakers and contributors, Ambassador Petriashvili, Mr. Winnerstig, Mr. Paet, because your expertise is very, very valuable, and in a way, since you represent different areas and different experiences, I think it opens the topic very well up to the public. So many, many thanks once more, and looking forward to continuing these discussions in the months to come. Thank you and goodbye.